Okay, this video recording is specifically looking at the key knowledge of oxygen uptake at rest, during exercise, and during recovery. This includes the deficit that we experience when we first start exercising, our steady state, when we plateau, and when we finish exercising. So firstly, as you can recall, oxygen uptake or oxygen consumption, VO2, is the amount of the volume of oxygen taken in, transport, and utilized by the body. We measure it in milliliters per kilogram per minute. As you can see from this graph, oxygen consumption and intensity has a linear relationship, which means that as intensity increases, as does oxygen consumption. On the graph, it reached a point of VO2 max. That means that the athlete has reached the most amount of volume of oxygen that they can take in, transport, and utilize. Once reached that point, oxygen consumption at VO2 max remains the same. It plateaus because the body can't take it anymore. Now, that's not to say that you're not working above VO2 max. For example, in the final sprints of things, you can work above an intensity, above your VO2 max, because you're contributing energy or ATP anaerobically. So, linear relationship, oxygen intensity goes up, so does oxygen consumption. Now, when we exercise and intensity increases, harder, faster, we get, when intensity doesn't increase, our body has an opportunity to meet the oxygen demand with the supply from our cardiorespiratory and respiratory systems. Now, when we get to a point where intensity doesn't increase, where intensity stays the same, our body reaches a steady state, and this is where oxygen supply, so the oxygen coming in, meets the demands of the body, and that is at a steady state. So although exercise intensity goes up, so does oxygen consumption. When it doesn't, it can remain level. All right, so the level plateau or steady state is where oxygen supply equals demand, and that is replicated in the graph of the blue line. As you can see, the blue line, oxygen consumption is not increasing because intensity is not increasing. So, what is oxygen deficit? Oxygen deficit is the temporary shortage of oxygen at the beginning of exercise. We start exercising, the demand for oxygen is huge. Our respiratory, cardio, and muscular systems cannot supply enough oxygen quick enough, and hence we are in oxygen deficit. And that means, therefore, the ATP being produced is being produced anaerobically. As you can see from the graph, the orange section is the oxygen deficit. That's where the body is in shortage. When politicians talk about the national deficit, it means that we're in shortage of money, so they generally put taxes up. Now, this doesn't just happen at the beginning of exercise, although it primarily does. It also happens when we surge. I'll jump back to the previous graph. As you can see by the red, this is when an athlete is, say, going up a hill. We're experiencing oxygen deficit because our supply is not as great as our demands. So, as stated in the introduction, although VO2 max is the maximal amount of oxygen we can take in, transport, and utilize, we can actually be performing above our VO2 max. In fact, we can be up to 200% of VO2 max or 400% of VO2 max. we are just above 100% of VO2 max, this is where we are producing the ATP anaerobically. As you can see from the graph, the blue denotes the oxygen uptake, how much oxygen we are taking in, transporting and utilizing, and the green is how much oxygen we're in deficit, and that indicates how much energy is being produced anaerobically. And this happens at the beginning of exercise and also during surges, during events. Simply put, the demands are not being met, therefore an athlete will experience oxygen deficit. This graph helps you to identify oxygen deficit. As you can see, every time intensity increases, the athlete cannot meet the demands of oxygen with its supply. So the blue triangles represents oxygen deficit. So intensity exercise, oxygen deficit, they reach a plateau, supply equals demand, intensity increases again, and so we're in more oxygen deficit, we get to a plateau, up again. So every time this athlete is surging or intensity is increasing, whether or not it's a heel or they're overtaking somebody, they're experiencing oxygen deficit. So oxygen deficit doesn't just occur at the beginning of exercise, it can also happen throughout. So steady state. Steady state, as you can see by the graph, is when oxygen supply equals demand. So the amount of oxygen coming in is met by the demand is met by the supply. I demand 3 bits of oxygen, right, there's the supply of 3, everyone's happy, our steady state is reached. So simply put, supply equals demand. This graph also shows the blue section is the deficit and the green part is what we're coming up to. This is the amount of oxygen consumed in recovery above resting levels, which is called oxygen debt. Hang on. Before we go on, a reminder of our VO2 maxes is for men and women. So for a national endurance sport, such as cross-country skiing, our VO2 max is as high as 68 or 70 for women and over 80 for men. That's measured in milliliters per kilogram per minute. For someone really active, it's around 45 to 50, depending upon man or woman. So, for example, my VO2 max is, I think, predicted around 50. More elite sports people is much higher than that, as high as 60 to 80 milliliters per kilogram per minute. You will need to know the approximate VO2 maxes of elite athletes. Now, these are primarily endurance type events that have a very high VO2 max because they require oxygen to produce their energy aerobically. Okay, so getting on to the last part, oxygen debt. Think of when you owe people money, you need to repay a debt. You're repaying oxygen. It's the amount of oxygen that we owe our body. So oxygen debt, or another name for it, is EPOC, exercise post or post-exercise oxygen consumption. So it's the amount of oxygen we take in, transport and utilize during the recovery period when it's still above resting levels. And this is largely aerobic. We're working aerobically. Our ATP demands have dropped because we've stopped exercising, but we still need we still need an increase in oxygen to help remove waste products, resynthesize lactate back into ATP. So it is the volume of oxygen consumed during recovery that is above rest levels. And this is denoted in your graph here in the purple and the pink. There's the fast replenishment and the slow replenishment. And as you can see, it can take some time until VO2 or oxygen consumption reaches resting levels. Finally, here is a graph that shows all 3 of the parts: oxygen deficit, the beginning, all right, denoted by the blue shaded section. When our demand for oxygen is greater than we can supply, then we reach a steady state, we're flat, and then our oxygen debt, that's the amount of oxygen we're consuming during recovery that is above rest levels.